This morning we're going to be studying the philosophy of humanism exceeding the limitations of science. But before we get into the lesson, we want to remember a few of the concepts that we have encountered and will continue to encounter in this series of lessons. We want to remember that a worldview is how we look at or how we interpret things that we encounter in life. We want to remember that a biblical worldview is recognizing that God has given us all things that pertain into life and godliness, and so we need to acknowledge or recognize God in all of our actions and all of our thoughts. We want to remember that a secular humanist worldview does not acknowledge God, but rather believes only in the physical. Only the physical exists. There's no spirit, there's no God. And as we will study today, the secular humanist worldview, truth is considered to be only that which can be acquired by science and human reasoning. The learning objectives for our lesson this morning will be to recognize the proper use of and limitations of science and human reasoning in acquiring knowledge. And we also want to recognize that God has revealed to all men all of the objective information that is needed to deduce proper conclusions about him and what the purpose of human life is. The approach that will be taken in our lesson this morning will be to review some background information about reasoning and faith. We want to define what science is. We want to summarize some of the limitations of science. We want to review some assertions that humanists make about science and reason. And in order to answer a question that was recently asked, I guess via the church Facebook, we want to answer a question about how it is that humanism is being taught in the schools and universities today. Let me point out that this lesson was taught last week to the middle school and high school class, but it was taught on a much different level. It wasn't in nearly as much detail as what we're going to go into today. It was on a more interactive basis. So for you parents, after this lesson is posted on the church website, I would encourage you to go over it with your children, because you know what they're capable of learning and how you need to rephrase things perhaps. So we'll begin with some background information. After we go over the background, we'll pause and see if there's any questions. And then we'll pause after we define science and the limitations of science and see if you have any questions there too. So we all know that God created people with the ability to reason, and God expects people to use that ability to draw proper conclusions about Him and what their purpose in life is. From the evidence of His creative power He has revealed in nature, He expects men to deduce that He exists. God also expects people to reason from the evidence and testimony in the Bible that it is indeed His written revelation to man, which should be believed and obeyed. Science, properly used, is a logical, systematic methodology for obtaining information about the physical universe. Legitimate science is a tool that acquires more information concerning God's general or natural revelation of His deity and power. Illegitimate science bears false witness of the existence of God, claiming that there is no evidence that He exists. God expects people to reason. He expects people to prove, to test, examine all things, and to hold fast those things which are proven to be true. And we see that in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. God also expects us to test or to examine the doctrines of teachers to determine if what they are teaching is true or not. And we see that in 1 John 4, verse 1. God expects people to reason from His general or natural revelation to reach the conclusion that there is a supernatural being who created it all. Psalm 19, verse 1 exemplifies this divine expectation of men. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. Anybody know what this is a picture of? It's the surface of Mars. It looks like something on Earth, but it's the surface of Mars. This is part of God's handiwork. This is part of the planets and stars that he put into the expanse of the firmament that he created on the fourth day of creation. Notice how different it is from Earth. We know that there are deserts on the earth that look like this, but the whole planet doesn't look this way. All of Earth is not a desert like this. Mars is obviously not suitable for human life just by looking at it. Its atmosphere is 96% carbon dioxide, and it has trace amounts of other gases in it, but there's not enough oxygen in there for human beings, obviously, to live on. The average surface temperature is minus 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature ranges anywhere from 86 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 284 degrees Fahrenheit. So obviously Mars is very different, but God created it. So there's an obvious difference here, as Mars is different by design. The earth is different by design. God did not make Mars to be inhabited by people. He made the earth to be inhabited by people. So earth is very unique in this regard. The uniqueness of the earth, having exactly the right conditions for life to exist, is not unnoticed by secular humanists. But as shown here, they draw the wrong conclusions because of their atheistic worldview. Note in the sentence up there, it says, our universe seems fine-tuned. Not that it is, but it seems fine-tuned to be favorable to life. But notice that it's not by design that it's fine-tuned, it's only by chance. And then notice the statement, what are the chances for that? Well, vanishingly small, as it says in this slide. Note the statement of this humanist. While acknowledging the uniqueness of the earth and having conditions just right for life, he ignored the true God in the universe, and he attributed this uniqueness to the gods of chance and probability. Out of billions of galaxies and billions of planets in those galaxies, the odds are that a few of those planets would have favorable conditions to life. So he's attributing it all to chance and probability. Well, let's note the absurdity of this statement. You know, the people that believe this way, they claim the universe is 3.7 billion years old. So out of the billions of galaxies and the billions of planets that exist there, why should we not expect that it would be favorable on some planets that iPhones just come into existence by themselves, or that power plants come into existence by themselves, or cars come into existence by themselves? These things are a whole lot less complex than the universe, a whole lot complex than living beings that God created. So you see the absurdity of this statement, but because of their worldview, they're blinded to the absurdity of this statement because they filter out knowledge to the contrary, or evidence to the contrary. In Acts chapter 14, Paul, speaking to the people of Lystra, he called them to turn from their false gods to the living God, who is the creator of the universe. Then Paul said in verse 17 that he did not leave himself without witness of his existence, and rain from the sky is listed as a witness of God's existence. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about this, the water cycle, but this is what Paul was referring to in Acts chapter 14. And this is just one of many, many, many examples that I wish we had time to talk about, of processes or organisms or things that God created that shows complex design. It shows such complexity that it's just absurd to think that it could all just come about by accident, that it obviously reflects great design, and the great designer is God. But perhaps you never thought about it, and the calculations are there for you to look at later if you want to, make sure I did the math right. But in case you never thought about it, about this great process that God has designed and set in motion for watering the earth, there's a tremendous amount of water that gets transported from the ocean to over the land to water the earth so that life can exist. And just looking at the average rainfall in the state of North Carolina, which is, according to the NC State, it's about 40 inches a year east of the mountains. So I just took 40 inches a year over the entire state, multiply that out over the surface area of the state, it comes to 34 cubic miles of water every year is transported from the ocean over the state of North Carolina. And that's all done without us having to do anything. Think of how complex an irrigation system would have to be if man designed it to be able to pump that much water. Because on average, that equals about 71 million gallons per minute of water that has to be pumped to equate to that much rainfall per year. So it's a tremendous, complex design that results in the earth being watered, and it didn't come about through accident. It came about because God created it, and so it stands as testimony of his existence. So from the complexity and order and design of the observable universe, God expects men to reason that he exists. And Romans 1, verses 18 through 20 tells us this. It says, that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Hebrews 11, verse 6 shows us that God expects people to reason from his word, his special revelation, to come to a conviction, a sure confidence that not only does he exist, but also that God rewards those who diligently seek him. Having a conviction and a sure confidence that God exists means that we can and we must be 100% sure that God exists. Just being 99% sure is not good enough. We have to be 100% sure that he exists, and that's what he expects. Hebrews 11, verse 1 tells us that faith is not believing in something that cannot be proven. Faith is not a leap in the dark. Faith is rather a firm, unshaken confidence, a conviction, a belief based upon credible evidence and testimony in things that cannot be physically seen or that have not been obtained yet. Romans 10, verse 17, and John chapter 20, verse 31 tells us that the Bible is the evidence and the credible testimony upon which faith is based. The Bible, of course, being God's special revelation to man. Since God expects us to prove all things, as taught in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21, we would expect God to provide us with evidence or proof that the Bible is indeed his written revelation to man. And God has given us that evidence, and Steve will be preaching about that tonight, about proving that the Bible is God's revelation. So the religion of secular humanism, as you learned last week, that secular humanism is a religion. It excludes God's general and special revelations and makes man the sole discoverer of all that can be known based on his reasoning ability and based upon the extensive use of the tool which he invented, this tool being science. The importance and capabilities of science and the employment of human reasoning is thus greatly overstated, as will be shown in some quotations that we'll look at later in this lesson. So before we get into what is science and what the limitations are, we'll pause here and see if you got any questions or comments about what's been said so far. Okay. So this is a quotation from the biology textbook that's used in Fort Mill High School, Miller and Levine Biology. And we'll use some quotations from it to describe what science is. It says, science is an organized way of gathering and analyzing evidence about the natural world. It is a way of observing, a way of thinking, a way of knowing about the world. Science is a process. Well, the process of science is often summarized in what's called the scientific method, and here you can see a typical chart showing a typical description of the scientific method, which begins with observing something. You observe some process, you observe some trends and data or something of this effect. And the process of observing, you identify some problem or you come across some question that you want to answer. So then you propose a hypothesis, it's an idea, it's a guess as to what might be the cause of that process or what might be the solution to that problem. And then you design and perform an experiment to test your hypothesis to see whether that hypothesis is true or not. And then based upon the results of that experiment, you then decide whether you need to do another experiment, because maybe the results of the experiment didn't turn out the way you wanted to, and so it didn't verify or validate your hypothesis, so then you have to start all over again. This is what's taught in school as the typical scientific method. Now, in practice, all the steps of the scientific method are not used in all investigations, and this slide contains some quotes that state that. And I'll have to say that in my own experience working in science as an engineer, I know that it's not necessary to do all of those steps to be able to solve problems that I've encountered in my work. So I only draw attention to these quotes so that you will know that if you do any reading in the scientific literature in your study of apologetics, that you'll be aware that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad science because you don't see every single one of these steps of the scientific method mentioned. That's part of their research. It really very much depends upon the situation as to whether or not you need to use all these steps or whether you can use some of these steps to answer the question. So I just want to make you aware of that. So in describing what science is, the Miller and Levine's biology textbook goes on to state that scientific endeavors never concern in any way supernatural phenomena of any kind. Now, on face value, there's nothing wrong with that statement since we know that you can't conduct any kind of experiments to study miracles. However, we know that scientific endeavors do concern themselves in supernatural phenomena when they claim that the universe and life were not created by supernatural means, but rather came into being by natural processes. So they violate what they say in doing that. We note also the statement on this slide that it says that scientists propose explanations that are based on evidence, not belief. Well, again, it would be nice if that was true all the time, but we'll talk about this claim some more later, but we'll see that that's really not the case. So a lot of times scientists do propose explanations that are based on their personal beliefs and not based upon evidence. So from a scientific perspective, again quoting from Miller and Levine biology, from a scientific perspective, all objects in the universe and all interactions among those objects are governed by natural laws. Now, this statement is true. You know, God does not miraculously violate or suspend the laws of nature today, so the physical universe is governed by natural laws. But it's natural laws that God created. He created them themselves. So we also need to keep in mind that man is both a physical and a spiritual being. And so God's spiritual law, the Bible, addresses the spiritual side of man. So note also that scientific inquiry can discover the natural laws of the universe, and that's the benefit of it. It helps us to understand that. But scientific inquiry cannot answer how these laws came into existence. So because science involves those things or events which may be observed either directly or indirectly, or may be subjected to testing or experimentation, or may be mathematically modeled, which allows verification and predictions to be made, science is limited only to those physical things or the physical aspects of living things. Science is limited to repeatable physical events or processes. So what are some of the limitations to science? Well, science, which is only a method of inquiry, cannot tell us how or when the universe or how or when life came into being. Science as an investigative tool can help us to discover much about our physical world, which shows evidence of design and complexity. Using the tool of science, we can discover and we can understand natural laws which dictate the order of things now, but they do not explain the origin of life or the origin of the universe. This physical evidence, this general revelation of God, points to his existence. The Bible, the special revelation of the creator of the universe, tells us that he created everything in 6 literal days. God's general and special revelation, therefore, are necessary to understand the world. But humanists reject both forms of revelation. So to illustrate the limitations of science, we'll pick one example here, but let's consider science can say that it is repeatedly observed in a closed system that energy is conserved. That means that energy can change forms, but it cannot be created, it cannot be destroyed. This is what's called in science the first law of thermodynamics. Well, we think about the universe obviously is a closed system. We don't have energy being transferred from outside the universe into the universe, because if it was, then there'd be another universe. So we don't see energy being transferred into or out of the universe to someplace else. So in stating that energy is conserved, the first law does not state or imply that energy in the universe is eternal. To infer that from that law is going beyond what the law states. It never says that energy has always existed or always will. So to say anything contrary, to say that somehow energy has always existed, is based on bias. It's not based on evidence. So we will pause at this point here and see if you have any questions or comments before we move on. Yes? Talk real loud so I can hear you.
Sure. One thing, and this is more just a comment than anything else, but when you talk about the scientific method, you talk about observing processes. And you also mentioned that can only apply to things that you can see currently. One of the big things in the sciences is this idea of uniformitarianism, which there was a debate between uniformitarian scientists in the 1800s versus catastrophist scientists in the 1800s as well. The idea of uniformitarianism is that all natural processes that are observable today have been working basically the same way since the beginning of time. So that's how they extrapolate processes backwards, right?
Right.
So like if I can see that given a certain slope, a certain amount of water can erode, a certain amount of land of this particular rock type in a 100-year period, then I can extrapolate that backwards per se, and I can reconstruct, the Earth history in that way. That makes two assumptions. One, it makes an assumption that things have always been the way that they are currently, which is not a bad assumption. But the second assumption is that we don't know what the starting point was, right? So if we look at like a plateau, and we can see that like the Grand Canyon has been cut through the plateau, well, who's to say that the canyon wasn't there in the beginning, right?
Right.
So you're making the assumption that the whole Earth was flat at one point in time, basically, and now we're working backwards from this point.
Right, right.
And that's always been my problem with the idea, is that we don't know what the baseline is.
Right. Everybody hear what he was saying? He's talking about uniformitarianism, which is one of the things that is assumed by humanists and scientists that believe along this way, is that these natural laws have always been this way, and that there's never been any interruption in that. And so in order to infer how things were back in time, you look at erosion rates, you look at things of that sort, and you back calculate and say, we see a mountain degraded by this much or a canyon this big, and therefore we infer, well, the Earth has to be that old. What's the major flaw in that? We've already talked about that. What do humanists ignore? Revelation. Because in the absence of revelation from God, we wouldn't know any different, would we? How would we know that there was a flood unless we look to God's revelation to know that there was a flood that drastically altered the earth? And so when having that knowledge, we can now go back and look at, all the different disruptions in the different strata and the soils and all the fossils and things of that sort. We can now interpret those in light of the knowledge that we gained from God's revelation that there was a flood. When you ignore, when you reject, because it's contrary to your worldview, when you reject God, you reject His revelation, then you have to come up with other explanations for it, and that's why they come out with millions and millions of years, of soil erosion and things of this sort, which somehow magically buries things quickly and causes them to fossilize, which is not what we see in the real world, because when things die, they get eaten by scavenger animals, and then the bones, they're exposed to the sunlight, and they crack and decompose over time, and so you don't have nice, neat fossils being formed today. So the point is, it's a good point, and it illustrates what happens when you reject revelation, and that's the major flaw in their thinking, is they reject God's general revelation, they reject God's special revelation. Yes? One more, and then we got to move on.
I think I would say the scientific method is sound. The problem is that scientists, that evolutionists, I should say, and also those who don't believe in a God, they don't use the scientific method themselves, because if they did properly, they would come to the same conclusion we as creationists believe in. For example, like you said, someone who in the humanistic world would believe that natural and basically matter and people have always existed, and the laws of science have always existed. The fundamental question is who set that up, or where did that come from? And for them to say no God exists, no designer, they have to say it's eternal. But scientific, that is a hypothesis that can be experienced and verified. And in fact, the data is out there that in fact points to a beginning. And that beginning can be measured through the expansion of the universe and a lot of different methods that have been identified through cosmology. But that points to a beginning, and that itself validates or invalidates their hypothesis.
Right.
That matter has always existed.
Right.
So then you get back to the same thing. Well, that hypothesis then is invalidated. Therefore, I have to go back to the beginning. What's the next best hypothesis? There is a designer that has designed this.
Right.
And that's where the evidence leads. And the evidence, if you look at whether it's biology, whether it's the physical sciences of the water vapor cycle, whether it's cosmology, all those sciences point to the evidence of a designer.
Right.
And that's why it says in Romans, chapter 1, that people are without excuse.
Right. They're without excuse.
The evidence of God is all around us.
Right. Right. But we need to move on because we only got 17 more minutes. But let me say that in the evidence that God has provided, notice the quality of the evidence that He's provided. He's provided evidence that is not so powerfully overwhelming that it forces people to draw the conclusion that He exists. So it allows men to have free choice. And Thomas Warren, he makes a very good explanation of that. You ought to read his book, Have Atheists Proven That There Is No God? He makes that very point. For man to be able to have free will, the evidence of his existence has to be there, but it can't be so strong that he's overpowered so that he has no choice but to believe it, because if he did, he wouldn't have free will. He has to be able to reject it. And we see that all the time. We see people who are rejecting it because of their biases that are there, just like we see, in various things in religion. People have biases for all kinds of things, and it blinds them to what the truth is. So appreciate the comments. So secular humanists assert a number of things about science and reason. They assert that science and reason are the only methods of acquiring information about the world in which we live, and we've already talked about that, how they reject God's general and special revelation, which are extremely important sources of information. They teach that the existence of God is not supported by science and reason. They teach that science and reason supports the theory of evolution. And they teach that morals should be developed by science and reason. And Steve will be talking about the ethics of humanism next week in our Sunday morning class. So what we have here is some quotations from different humanist documents regarding the first assertion that we made. When we look at a secular humanist declaration, it says we are committed to the use of the rational methods of inquiry, logic and evidence in developing knowledge and testing claims to truth, reason and science being that method that they accept. We know of no better substitute for the cultivation of human intelligence. Notice that from the Humanist Manifesto 2, any account of nature should pass the test of scientific evidence. Well, again, scientific evidence is in the eyes of the beholder. It's in their eyes. They determine what's scientific and what isn't. So in our judgment, the dogmas and myths of traditional religions do not do so. So they're showing their bias here, that we don't believe that biblical accounts of creation, biblical accounts of nature are rational. Reason and intelligence are the most effective instruments that humankind possesses. Pretty arrogant, ain't it? We can figure it all out. We don't need anything else. Knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Humanists find that science is the best method for determining this knowledge. We consider the universe to be a dynamic scene of natural forces that are most effectively understood by scientific inquiry. We believe the scientific method, though imperfect, is still the most reliable way of understanding the world. Hence, we look to the natural, biological, social, and behavioral sciences for knowledge of the universe and man's place within it. And then regarding the second assertion that science and reason do not support the existence of God, in a secular humanist declaration, it says, we find that traditional views of God are either meaningless, have not yet been demonstrated to be true, or are tyrannically exploited. Well, that shows a lot of bias there, don't it? Y'all are being manipulated. Y'all are being manipulated by religious leaders so that they can control you in believing that there is a God. That's what that statement means. We find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of a supernatural. And because the existence of God is rejected, they also reject a revelation of God to man. And so secular humanism places trust in human intelligence rather than in divine guidance. And that's a quote from a secular humanist declaration. And then the third assertion is that humans are the result of unguided evolutionary change. What's the significance of the word unguided there? Humanists are the result of unguided evolutionary change. What does that rule out? I'm sorry? Yeah, but it rules out theistic evolution, because there are religious people who will compromise and say, well, the evidence is so overwhelming that evolution is true. Then they compromise it and say, well, God must have used that to bring about life, but God was the instigator of it. So in saying that it's the result of unguided evolutionary change, it's saying, we're not even going to give you credit that God used evolution. There was no God involved in this. That's the significance of that. It shows you how far their bias is against God. The theory of evolution is supported so strongly by the weight of evidence that it is difficult to reject. It's difficult to reject. So, these humanist assertions of overstating the capabilities of science and human reasoning and rejecting revelation from God are widely accepted in our society. These assertions are so pervasive that they are being taught in the secondary schools and in the public universities. Now, in Lesson 13, which Dave will be teaching on the philosophy of humanism in public education, he'll go into greater detail about that. And it's not my intent to steal any of his thunder in teaching that. But because some of these exact statements that we've talked about the overstating what science and human reasoning can do, because some of these are taught and are in writing in the public textbooks and in the state education standards, I wanted to go over that for a few minutes in the time that we got remaining. So when we look at the South Carolina Education Standard for Biology 1, and this is the standard telling, here's what we want the students to get out of Biology 1. You'll notice that in B 5.5 and 5.6, it states there that the students are to demonstrate an understanding of biological evolution by giving examples of scientific evidence in anatomy, embryology, biochemistry, and paleontology that supports the theory of evolution. And they are to be able to show common ancestry of organisms using an evolutionary tree. So the state standard is consistent with the third humanist assertion that we read, is that science and reason support the theory of evolution. And as we'll see in a minute, the high school textbook that they use, Miller and Levine Biology, complies with the state education standard in supporting the theory of evolution. Now, back to the statement that we read previously, it says in Miller and Levine Biology on page 5, scientists propose explanations that are based on evidence, not belief. Well, in saying that, what does the context reflect? They're contrasting belief with evidence, so they're using the word belief to mean something for which there is no evidence or proof. So is it the case that scientists always propose something? They always propose explanations that are based on evidence. Well, that's not true. I mean, as Matt talked about, and as we've talked about some today, scientists are humans. Humans have biases. And so it is not the case that scientists are completely devoid of biases, that they never allow I'll get to it in a second. They never allow their beliefs to enter into how they propose things. It is not the case that scientists are always objective. It's not the case that, that they don't have some interest in their in the outcome of their experiments. We talked about the scientific method, and you notice that all along the way, there's places for human judgment to enter into that. So it's human judgment as to whether or not this test proved my hypothesis. It's human judgment of what the hypothesis is. So it is often the case that people are very much interested in the outcome of their experiments, and so they're biased in that respect. The book did point out, and I was glad it pointed out there, it talked about the value of peer-reviewed papers or having their research peer-reviewed in order to kind of weed out the biases. But think about that a minute in the subject of evolution. Evolution is so pervasive that when evolutionists present technical papers on evolution, are they going to get any objective scrutiny of their results and say, this is not right? The peer reviewers have the same biases against God, the same biases toward evolution that the investigators have. And so when you have a systematic bias like that, it's not going to be an objective check to what science is, and so we need to understand that. Matt?
You said it much more articulate than I would have. I was going to say the same thing. In the biology is this greatest example. There's so much evidence, going back to the scientific method, so much evidence that invalidates that hypothesis of evolution. And that evidence is ignored. Now, in the scientific method, the process is it's been invalidated.
Right.
That's where you've got to go back to the beginning and assert a new hypothesis. But the problem is that evidence is ignored. And we could go into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 lessons about all that evidence. But fundamentally, that evidence is left out. And the biggest one is there's no evidence of evolutionary changes between kinds.
Right.
They use instead evidence of variation within a species to extrapolate in all the way to evolution of a single cell
Right.
organism.
That's right.
There is no evidence that supports actually the physical creation from the elements of the natural elements
Right.
into a living organism.
That's right. That's right. And those are all separate lessons in themselves. So, yes.
He brought up a point that I wanted to say, and that's that when I was in school, we were taught, and even in college, we were taught that the scientific method includes not only the experiments that you design to prove it, but you can't prove it until you've shown that you can't make it fail. So there's 2 pieces to that puzzle. They don't teach that anymore. And in academia, they do not do that anymore. They still do it in industry, which is where I worked, because the company doesn't want to put $1 gazillion into something if you haven't shown that it can't fail. Takata airbags are an example of that. So, you don't want to have a situation like that. So you're going to do that. And math and science go hand in hand, and sometimes, because the math is the whole statistical process of it, it just gets me really upset, as you can see. But they completely ignore the fact anybody can prove anything with
Right.
an experiment, that it's true.
Right.
But you have to make it fail, or you have to prove that you can't make it fail.
Right.
And they completely ignore that, and they don't teach it anymore. And yes, about the whole breed and species specific. And so parents, one of the things that you can tell your kids when, and they need to be respectful to their teachers. Most teachers around here are, don't believe all this stuff, but they're forced to have to teach it. So they're open to the kids saying things. But you can't breed a cat and a dog. That can't happen. But you could manipulate a fox and a dog, or a wolf and a dog. So that's what they want to say is that, you know, that's proof of evolution. Well, it's not proof of
Right.
evolution. They're all the same in the canine family. But you can't take something from the canine family and cross it, no matter how much you manipulate it, with something from the fetus. So that's something you can tell your kids. You can't cross those two. So
Right.
anyway, yeah, they took out the whole part of the fact that the only way you can prove something is to also show that it can't fail.
Right.
And they took that whole part of it out.
Right. The message we need to get out of all of this is we need to be skeptical of things. We need to do what God says to prove all things, and you need to dig into things and not just take some scientist said this or they claim that experiments teach this, because as in the next slide, this is on page 450 and 465 of the textbook. Although it is clear that a great deal about evolution remains to be learned, every scientific test to date has supported Darwin's basic ideas. Well, as it's already been talked about, that's simply not true, because the testing, the experiments that they've done have not addressed the things that they need to be addressed, which is, as we pointed out here, and Matt got ahead of me some, which means minds think alike a lot of times. But we ask, you know, what experiments have been conducted when species have been changed to another species, resulting in an increase in genetic information by unguided processes? They've never done that. Or what experiments created life from non-living molecules? Or has DNA ever been created by random mixing and reaction of chemicals? You know, that just doesn't happen. And if we think about, you know, if you want to look at man or living organisms as just being a mass of chemicals, and that if you get the right chemical combination right, then boom, it becomes living. Think about when an animal dies or when a person dies. You know, 10 seconds after they're dead, their body hasn't started decomposing yet. It has the same chemical composition that it had when it was alive. I know the blood chemistry starts changing rapidly, but it hasn't started decomposing. So if you were smart enough to come up with the chemical composition for a man and create it, there's something else about it that makes it living, because it's just not alive. And that's the problem that they cannot test. That's the problem that they avoid. Yes?
Building on what's been said, therefore, when invalidation occurs of a hypothesis, you go back to the beginning. You know, we're both scientists, so we get this, but the next piece is you go back to the observation. And building on what you're saying, if you observe DNA, immediately you observe it with what you know and what you've seen in other things. And it is inescapable, the design that is in DNA.
Oh, I know.
Every one of us in here has an iPhone, and then we understand operating systems and code. And we see binary code, and we can see lines of code, and we can understand a man created that operating system for iPhone. But when you look at DNA, that's exactly what you see. You see an operating code that God has designed that is infinitely more complex than the operating system for the iPhone, the OS.
Right. I agree. We're going to have to stop. Let me make this comment, and then we'll stop, and y'all can look at the rest of the presentation when it gets posted, because there's more there. But, you know, I work in nuclear power, and in nuclear power plants, we got extensive amounts of documentation, you know, about our design basis documents and how things are supposed to function, how they're supposed to work. There's tons and tons of design information on how to build it and how it's supposed to work. Does any rational person think that that just came about by random chance? I mean, even, I can tell you, it's been through many revisions, because human beings make mistakes, and so we find errors, and we're constantly having to revise our design basis documents. That's what DNA is. It's God's design basis document. It's actually his construction documents on how to build living things, and it's just beyond comprehension to think that came about by accident. Yeah, you'll have to be our last comment.
I just wanted to say that
Agreed.
And as parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, teachers, one of the things I think that is imperative is that we don't take a victim stance and think that we have no choice. We have a lot of choices, and we need to start with teaching our children, not giving them facts, not, well, here's what you say if your teacher says this. We need to teach our children how to think.
Right.
Because there's nothing wrong with reason, because the Bible teaches
That's right.
that Paul actually said reason.
Right.
So we're instructed to reason. So having a sharp mind is not the problem. The problem is how we use our tools.
That's
And
right.
We don't use a drill to cut down a Christmas tree. So it's important that as parents, we arm our children, regardless of whether they find themselves in a public school, a private school, a homeschool, a co-op, a boarding school, a secular university, or a Christian university. They will find error in thought regardless of where they are. And so if we do not teach our children how to think, if we don't teach them what actually is logic. I mean, I think if everybody sits down and just thinks about, do I really know what logic is? Do I know what a logic fallacy is? We'll find that a lot of us have errors in our own thinking. And as far as the natural laws and everything are concerned, there's one natural law that every science believes to be true, which is the law of entropy, which is that systems tend to go from a state of order to disorder.
Right.
Okay, well, if that's true, and if it's true in every branch of science, then what ordered it to begin with? So their very own
Right.
laws disprove it. And so I've always, when I teach high school science, I've always taught the created cannot explain the creator. You just can't. If I drop a truck in your driveway, no matter how much you know about engineering, you cannot tell me how every part of that truck was manufactured and assembled. No matter how much you know about cars, because you don't know where the parts came from or where the raw materials came from. And so the fact that we can take apart anything that's on the planet does not give us the ability to determine where it came from.
Right, right. And we'll end with this. This is the value of coming to Bible class, because you're not sitting at home with your one mind. You're sitting with how many people are here? 150, 200 maybe? You get the collective wisdom of all those people, and that's why it's important to come to Bible study, so we can study God's Word together and share ideas. So I appreciate everyone being here this morning. Thank you.